Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to this session entitled Protecting Rights, Resisting Securitized Responses to the Pandemic. And it's a really auspicious time as we are all on Zoom to be having this conversation about how we respond to a global pandemic, which has been an extraordinary imposition on the rights of almost every human living on the planet. But as well as the way in which we are experiencing the pandemic, we're also really obviously noticing extraordinary impositions on the rights of individuals and groups during this time. We see limitations on a range of rights: expression, assembly, privacy, political participation, and more than that, across the globe, governments, municipalities, and cities are having to take exceptional measures to respond to this pandemic. So in addition to thinking about our health, we are also thinking about the effects on rights during this pandemic and what might a securitized response mean for the long-term integrity of our governance systems and our systems of rights protection and enforcement across the globe. We are seeing, I suppose, the dangers that come with the consolidation of exceptional powers in a time of health emergency. In particular, I think this panel is focused on the potential consolidation of authoritarian practices and powers, the targeting of dissent and the ways in which the pandemic can particularly allow governments who are weak or authoritarian to focus, to use their powers against the vulnerable, those who dissent, those who are minorities. So I hope this panel is going to allow us to really dig into the interplay between old powers of limitations on the globe alongside the new powers, the new practices, and how we might in this time mobilize to prevent the encoding or hardwiring of rights stunting, governance debilitating, and transparency avoiding practices around the world. So to do that, I have a really extraordinary and diverse panel with me here today. Three leaders who are going to really help us think about these questions. I'm going to introduce them briefly because they have extraordinary biographies that might take us all of the time we have available if I were to read them through. I'm going to introduce Patrick Gaspard, who's the president of the Open Society Foundations, a former diplomat who was the ambassador to South Africa between 2013 and 2016 for the United States, among his many accolades. I'm going to introduce Sirikan Charoisiresi, who is a human rights lawyer, an activist who has been charged with offences for her activism, who has undertaken really extraordinary work on the ground at the grassroots level to fight for rights both before and during this pandemic. And finally, I'm going to introduce the exceptional mayor of Bogota, Colombia, Claudia Lopez, whose innovation at the city level is really an object lesson for us, thinking about how to do innovative things in a time when that is extremely difficult to do. So I'm going to start actually posing the first question to Claudia. And as a mayor of a city, Claudia, city level responses are just, we're all learning, are a critical mode of responding to the pandemic. And as leader of Bogota in this time, you have shown extraordinary innovation and you've mobilized inclusion And in a way, I think many of us would say you've sought to optimize a rights-based response to this health, economic, and social challenge. So can you tell me and tell us all a little bit about about your response to the pandemic? And in particular, can you tell us what other cities and governments can learn from what you do and how you do it?
Well, thank you so much for inviting us to share our experience that has been so challenging in this year. Let me tell you first that I'm the first woman elected to the mayor's office of Bogota, which is a great honor. And as usual, we are used to women to tackle difficult challenges and to having harder barriers than other people. But I never imagined that this year was going to be so challenging and so hard. So what we have done is basically, we have a DNA of civic culture in Bogota. Bogota has a legend on this, a legacy on this. And that has been the key. You know, every measure that we have taken so far to deal with the pandemic have been supported between 70 and 80% of Bogota's people. And I think that's the key, is to unite efforts, to be very pedagogic, very educational, to explain people why we're doing everything that we are doing, what it is based on science. And that was the first thing that we did. We had the fortune that all the best private and public universities in our country are located precisely in Bogota. The best scientific team from the medical people, from the epidemiologists, from economists, sociologists. So we assemble a scientific-based team, and we follow their recommendations. That was the first thing that we did. Second of all, we made the decision that, of course, taking care of lives was the first purpose of everything. All material things could be recovered. Life, if you lost it, is impossible to recover. So health and life and care, and not only health care, but also social care, poverty care, different social needs. We're going to take the lead and to be the first thing beyond any material or economic that we could tackle. So first life, and then other challenges. The third thing that we did is that we very early focused on increasing the capacity of the epidemiological and medical people in our city. We are an 8 million people city, very dense, with incredibly high levels of poverty and inequality. And we only have, at the very beginning of the pandemic, 935 critical care units in our hospitals, which was incredibly insufficient for such a challenge. At the very beginning, we only could do 200 tests per day. 200 tests per day. That was nothing. We have 3 labs, able to process PCR tests. Now, after 6 months, we have in place more than 2,200 intensive care units, more than the double. We recruit every healthcare worker around the country that could help us. We train them specifically. And I have to say that they have been the heroes and heroines of this pandemic. They came together, they retrained themselves, they offered to train others to ensemble the best team possible. We passed from 3 labs processing PCR tests to 18 labs. We are now able to do more than 20,000 tests per day, which is a very different from 200. That was the capacity that we have at the very beginning. And we did this incredible learning and pedagogic and civic campaign for everybody since April. Everybody has to use mask. And we test every day, in interviews and different studies around the city. 93% of people in Bogota use properly their mask every day in every space. They learn to washing their hands, to have different measures, to keep social distance. We organize the mobility of our city. We reduce up to 50% the mobility in our public transport system. That has been challenge financially because we are moving, the 100% of the capacity with less than 50% of the people. So that's a huge gap and deficit financially, but health was first. We increased, Bogota is known around the world because we have the best cycloway capacity, cyclo corridors in all the developing world. We have 550 kilometers of bike network in our city. We increased in 85 kilometers that network, and we went from 6.6% of total travels per day by bike to 13% of total travels by bike in our city now. So all these measures together, the education, the transformation, the quarantine, early in time, along with the increase in the health system capacity, all the incredible contribution of people, of entrepreneurs, everybody understands that was the first priority. That has helped us to have now, we are in America, between all the cities, among all the cities, of more than 5 million people, big cities, big metropolis. Yep. We have the lowest mortality rate in America at this moment, only 2.3%. But that only, we suffer because it is almost 8,000 lives that we have lost. Now, comparing to the risk in an 8 million people, 10 million people metropolitan region, in a mid-income country level, that was a great challenge. And I think that so far, we can never, chant victory because this is still a very quite challenge. But so far, we're doing pretty well. And I appreciate the big effort that our people have done so far.
So that's an extraordinary story of resilience, as well as, I think, just a model for inclusion and bringing people into the process. I want to speak to another part of the world and a really different set of challenges, which are to June. June, you find yourself on the ground in the heartbeat of protest, and you're in the middle of a process which is seeking to transform Thai democracy. And I wonder if you can tell us what it means to engage in transformative action in the middle of a pandemic. What can you tell us about what we learn about grassroots power in a time like this?
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you everyone for joining today. Speaking of Thailand, first of all, I have to say that Thailand has been pretty well on, dealing with the COVID-19 due to the fact of we have quite good medical system and personnel. However, in the past 7 months, Thailand has been under the nationwide emergency decree, under the special laws that imposed to respond to the continued claims of the government that they wanted to maintain all the measures to prevent another outbreak or the second wave of the COVID-19. These security measures and restrictions, including the prohibition of gathering, of assembly, and also prohibition of dissemination or reporting, false information content of the COVID-19, which may instigate fear among the people. However, in the past recent months, the Thai government has intensified the use of sweeping powers to basically not focusing on combating the COVID-19 anymore, but more to suppress the anti-government movement and the protests, which have caught the gathered momentum since June until now. In August, if you are using Twitter, there's the trending hashtag on Twitter, hashtag what's happening in Thailand. The hashtag was pushed by a new generation of Thai activists calling for the world to pay attention to their demands, to our demands for freedom and democratic reforms. Young Thais also wanted the online community to bear witness to the government's responses. So throughout this 2020, Thailand has seen a youth organized and led protest movement around the country and has scattered momentum in Thailand. The protesters have repeatedly taken to the streets to demand a new constitution, a new government, an end to the harassment and intimidation of government critics, and also importantly, calling to reform the Thai monarchy, an institution protected by laws carrying severe criminal penalties. In response to that, the government used the state of emergency that has been imposed since the outbreak of the COVID-19. Over 7 months, we have been under the emergency decree, which grants special power to the authorities and also prevent the judicial oversight of the state actions, which creates the risk and environment for human rights violations and abuses on Thai people. However, despite these restrictions, the grassroots movement, the young activists, and the people continue to protest in the streets. So far, the Thai government has prosecuted at least 173 individuals just because of their role in the peaceful protests. In particular, the government has exploited the people's fear of seeing many people in the street protesting against the government as a claim that they need to extend the emergency situation. The government has already extended for 7 times of that special power. Recently in October, when thousands of young protesters, democratic activists continue on the streets, even after many multiple charges against them. Recently, there was an incident of unannounced Queen's motorcade passing through the anti-government's protest, which led to arrest and detention, prosecution of some protesters under serious crimes of committing violence against the Queen's liberty, facing life imprisonment. The government claimed such an incident as a basis and reasons to invoke another state of emergency on top of what they already have put in place for COVID-19. And so that, they use this to arrest and basically to crack down on the protest, on the peaceful protest, which is how to say that the Thai government has exploited the COVID-19 pandemic to enact repressive, sweeping emergency measures, which clearly have been used to end the peaceful protesters and online critics.
Thank you, June. That's really, I think, enlightening in terms of the dynamics on the ground, but I think also speaks to this more global challenge that we're seeing, which is the intersection between protest and pandemic. And it's a really litmus test, a lightning rod that tests us to see how we can actually ensure that we both manage a pandemic, but also manage political and participatory processes in inclusive and rights affirming ways. Patrick, can I ask you, in the context of all of those experiences from elsewhere, since 2016, you have seen the United States withdrawing from global leadership and from human rights protection across the globe. And I'm wondering how Open Society Foundations have responded. We have a new US administration. What do we learn from these experiences in other countries, and how should the world be viewing the potential for the US role as we look forward?
Thank you for inviting me into the conversation, Fionnuala. You touted all of us at the start, and we should give you your due. Thank you so very much for the vigilance that you have paid to these issues in many challenging spaces. So I could give a lengthy and detailed response to that question, but the first thing I'd say is, what I've learned is that we need to elect more Mayor Lopez's around the world, and we need to support more activists like Siricon everywhere that we find them. And it's just extraordinary to be on a panel with them. It has been a long and arduous journey over the course of the last 4 years in the United States. This is a nonpartisan forum that we're all engaged in, but I think that it's fair to say that there has been a huge exhalation around the world with the notion that the United States would re-enter into the world community, re-enter into multilateralism, and once again center rights at the space that animates our own democracy and animates the discourse that we're invested in and engaged in around the world. In the Open Society Foundation, over these last few years, we've been since we are a global foundation, but that's anchored in the U.S., we've been pushing hard against the us versus them dichotomy that's been set up by the current administration and the one that's dominated not just foreign policy, but domestic policy as well these many years. And as we go into this transition, this point of pivot, there are a number of things that we want to make sure that are really driving what change could look like. The first thing is there needs to be a complete review and overhaul of security infrastructure in the U.S. There has to be a real and substantive conversation on what it means to end the forever wars that we find ourselves in. And we can't just use the rhetoric of bolstering multilateralism. There are some very granular things that we need to be able to hold our government to account on starting today. So on reviewing our national security infrastructure, that means policies, that means looking at budget priorities that help us to re-examine the assumptions so that the U.S. global engagement increases while pressing for greater alignment between interests and rights and values. On the forever wars, we all know that post 9/11, the U.S. And many of our allies, mostly through a mindset that the U.S. exported around the world, got the security and rights balance wrong post 9/11, and we have to look now at shifting that paradigm. This means directly working to end the authorization for use of military force that's enabled the U.S. to engage in unlimited, unbounded global war, but also to rethink the formation of alliances and support for authoritarian regimes like Sisi's in Egypt or Duterte in the Philippines, or unaccountable arms sales to the Saudis in Yemen. On bolstering multilateralism, Fionnuala, this has to include, most especially, the investment in the partnership in the United Nations. One of the things that I think is really critical that we've pushed for in OSF, and now is the time to pounce on it. I hope the mayor will agree, but we need to invest in a high-level office devoted to engaging civil society consistently in the UN, an office with real budget, real resources, and real agency in discussion. The UN cannot continue to be a place that provides cover for states like China and Russia to adopt repressive counter-terrorism measures that in effect really just suppresses dissent at home and throughout their regions. I'm sitting in a city right now that enacted measures during COVID to control the spread of the contagion, but that also had the impact of restricting dissent, restricting protest, and following the murder of George Floyd and the attempt by civil society to speak up and act out. Those restrictive policing measures really look to silence and repress the public square. Post 9/11, we saw the ability of American Muslims to speak out and to act for their rights, to be severely restricted in this country. And regrettably, those measures have been replicated elsewhere around the world. So now is the time to step forward, to take up the kinds of policies that Mayor Lopez has been a real champion of, and to make sure at this point of transition in the U.S., we don't just all rest on our laurels during the transition, but push accountability along the lines that I've described.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm struck. There's a line by an Irish poet called Seamus Heaney who says, "There are times when hope and history rhyme." And I think we're all in the moment where we're breathing on hope and history to rhyme, to bring about so much of the needed change. And I think your reflections on the need to reinvigorate old conversations in new ways, but also really this moment to seize the extraordinary power of civil society to be one of the transformative anchors of what happens next. And that thought, I want to go back to the mayor, to Claudia, and ask you, because very practically, Claudia, you faced the challenge of managing protests during a pandemic in the middle of an 8 million person city, as you've described, a dense, complex, bubbling city. And your administration really showed to us how it's possible to protest, to police or to manage protests in unique ways. So can you tell us just your thinking? How did you respond as you did? What was driving that thinking? But also, what do you think was gained by avoiding a militarized or securitized response to the problem? What did you as a leader gain, and what did your city gain from doing it differently?
Well, that has been quite a challenge. I mean, to have social life, family life, economic life, and also political life alive during the pandemic is quite a challenge. But it is possible. And I will say that is the decision to allow all these forms of living and expression is a political decision. It's a political decision. There is nothing in science that tells us that we should be able to work during the pandemic, but we are not able to express our political opinions during the pandemic. There is no scientific base that tells us that we could take the risks with biosecurity norms to go to the public space or to go to work, but there are no security and biosecurity work measures to go back to social or political life. That distinction is not based on science. Is based on political preference. And of course, I am a Democrat. I am a citizen. I am a person that has made throughout my life moving as an activist. I'm just a citizen activist that now happens to be a mayor, not the other way around, right? If I was not mayor, I would be on the streets fighting for the causes, for climate change, for social justice. So I perfectly understand that. I perfectly understand. I was elected on the base of women and youth people who are mobilizing for rights, for environmental rights, for social rights, for educational rights. And I fully agree and fully support that. So the problem is not protest. The problem is not democratization, mobilizing. That's great for society. What could be abnormal is that in the midst of social justice and economical justice and inequality, people just remain silent. That would be abnormal. The problem is not protest, the problem is violence. And what we should promote and ensure is try to commit all the actors, from police to citizens to social organizations, to respect the right of mobilization peacefully, and to reject any form of violent protest that is neither good for the social causes that are legitimate to mobilize and neither good for other people who not necessarily share the causes but take the opportunity to discredit the protest because of violence. So I think that's the second thing. The third thing is that as in Thailand, we have here since the last year incredible mobilization, social protests. Last year, the city was militarized by first time in the last 50 years by the former mayor and the actual president and the current president. And one young guy, Dillian Cruz, was assassinated by police officers abusing of their arms. So that was the city that I received. A city in which protest was criminalized, there was abuse of force, and there was militarization of the city. What we decided to do when we came in January, we enact a protocol, a protocol to guarantee social protest and to make sure that the use of legitimate force, not abuse of force, will be the very last resource. That the very first resource will be the recognition, the legitimization, the respect, the dialogue, the intervention of disarmed police, and just in very, very last step, if necessary, because of violence, some other forms of police, never military force in the city. But we have, before the pandemic in March, we have many mobilizations. It went relatively well. There was not that much violence. Nobody was dead, fortunately. But then the pandemic stopped this mobilization. And stop is like, they were not away. And the reasons of the mobilization didn't go away. Quite the opposite. We have now more reasons. Now the employment is the double that we have at the beginning of the year. Now poverty is the double that we have at the beginning of the year. So this was just, a very press thing, take for a while because of the pandemic. And in fact, in June, when life restarted after the quarantines, different quarantines and stuff, mobilization has come back. And unfortunately, we have our own George Floyd issue in August. And a citizen was killed by the police, was assassinated in a police station. And we have the same reaction, unfortunately, violent reaction, that the United States have in different cities because of the George Floyd thing. So that's the, unfortunate thing. Just in the year in which we recognize, we legitimize, we have a social protocol, we acknowledge and respect mobilization, there was such a brutal abuse police that produced this violent reaction. So we're now trying to recover that. I denounce personally to the police officers who did it. We are waiting that the judicial authorities will provide justice to their families. Of course, there's a tension with the police, and I am partially the chief police of the city because in Colombia, the police is nationally. So the actual chief of staff is the president. And we don't agree. The president has a policy that delegitimizes and he doesn't recognize. He's very unrespectful of people who are protesting. So that's a clash. That has been a tension that has been quite a challenge to manage this year too.
So that's a really, I feel like we're sitting in your office, which we almost are because we're all looking at your office, just seeing all of these problems that you are in the midst of. But I do think, as one of the questions in the chat has noted, cities and sort of if we think below the level of central government, so much innovative, interesting, path-breaking work is happening in this space, and I think this is just your words are an illustration and an inspiration for that. I'm going to ask June a question, which is really, and I think June, you've really sort of said this already, but I wanted you to amplify. The situation in Thailand isn't unique, but as Patrick said, it's illustrative of these broader global trends, which is that national security law, securitization, counterterrorism law are being used to quell political participation, protest. We've seen that in places, again in the chat, as far apart as the Philippines and Hong Kong. So many of these countries, these repressive apparatus is being used. So I guess I'm asking you, June, as an advocate, as an activist on the ground, how should we respond to these global trends? You're in Thailand, but what does Thailand say to the rest of the world about how to really, how to pull down, to challenge these global trends?
Okay, I think I missed a little bit of your ending sentence, but in Thailand, as I said, we the young generation and the democracy activists, we have learned also the examples and experiences from the mobilization, the democracy, human rights mobilization from around the world. So the resistance, resilience, and persistence on continue using the peaceful, non-violent patterns, activities, expressions are the key that the current people movement have continued to uphold. So that's the way that the movement has gathered and mobilized other groups, grassroots, on different issues on a wide range of human rights. It's not just civil and political rights, but also linked with socio-economic rights as well. So, and also the movement has used technology, and also example that they use creativity, arts, music, this sort of cultural performance to open the space. Yeah. And I think one thing is that the resistance that continue is that we have the local grassroots capacity. For example, like us human rights lawyers on the ground, that empowered the activists and the people to continue exercising their fundamental freedom in a peaceful way.
Mm-hmm. I love your analogy to art on the streets. I love the way in which some of what these protest movements are showing us is just how to be spectacular and how to be unexpected. And it's in that unexpectedness that often we find just the kernels of what will bring others along with us, that really moves us out of the ordinary. Patrick, I'm going to ask you maybe the final question, which is, as you alluded to in your opening remarks to my first question, the pandemic's response, like the national security response or reflex, is often framed by governments as this very crass trade-off between security and rights. You can have one or the other, but you can't have both. And I'm wondering what you can tell us about the problem of this dichotomy and how we might get away from thinking like that, and how could we recalibrate this world in a way this world is struggling so badly under COVID-19 that we're not choosing one thing or the other. And I wonder how you would reflect on that from your many years of experience.
Thank you. I'll attempt to do that as the final respondent, and I'll just add, Fionnuala, you were quoting Seamus Heaney's The Cure at Troy. That poem begins with the lines, "Don't hope on this side of the grave." But I'll tell you that the mayor and June give me plenty of reason to hope in the here and now that we're going to make tremendous progress on all of these issues. So in the Open Society Foundation, and clearly on this platform, we absolutely reject the false dichotomy between security and rights. As I noted before, all of our nations basically got this balance wrong in the aftermath of 9/11. And here's an opportunity for us right now to respond differently and to organize ourselves differently. Let's just take, for example, the way governments have leaned into techno-solutionism around the response to COVID that has a profound element of securitization and closure within it. Governments flocked towards contact tracing apps and new surveillance technologies that have proven to not only be not effective in restraining the spread of the disease, but have led to all manner of abuses. And this rapid expansion of the surveillance power remains ultimately in the hands of police and intelligence in an unaccountable way. And we have to, right now, today, make determinations about what kind of agency average citizens, civil society organizations need to have in how that data is sorted and how it's used for solutions ultimately in communities instead of for repression. We have to recognize that governments are right now in this hour using this window that they have to consolidate power. You noted before that I served as U.S. ambassador to South Africa. During this crisis, over 200,000 South Africans have been stopped and detained by police and military forces for violations of COVID. How could that be possible? Arresting over 200,000 people for social distance violations, and that is in an extraordinary republic and democracy. We know that there are alternatives to this kind of securitization that work. Mayor Lopez, of course, is a shining example of that, but we know in most places, populations that are most vulnerable, that are most susceptible to the illness, have the greatest stake in working with governments to lift up other partnerships that lead to open debate and public accountability, and that creates an enabling environment that arrests the illness and creates more democratic opportunity. Very, very quickly, Fionnuala, I'll tell you that right now in our foundation, we've made a series of investments to push back against securitization in spaces, totaling about $5 million today. That confronts this question, but we're looking to expand it, and we're looking for partners. For example, we're testing new progressive security measures in Brazil in light of the municipal elections in 2020. In Nigeria, we're coordinating international advocacy agencies against the military's attempt to stop the SARS demonstrations. And at the UN, we're backing a broad civil society coalition to reform UN counterterrorism and combat repressive forces. Think about this one last thought. Last year, the UN and its agencies spent over $500 million on counterterrorism and only $100 million on the work of human rights. Something is out of skew here, and we've got to get that balance right if we're going to have ultimate peace, security, and true democratic participation.
No, and thank you, Patrick. And I know from my own day-to-day work in the UN as Special Rapporteur, that sense in which there's been an extraordinary distortion of priorities. And maybe this is one of the 9/11 legacies. And we're coming up to the 20th anniversary of the events of 9/11, which coincides hopefully with the end of a global pandemic. And it seems to me that is maybe the moment, to use Heaney's words again, that we have this once in a lifetime opportunity where maybe a tidal wave of justice, a real sort of tsunami of change can be seen. And it is certainly true that it is a moment to pause, to really reject these false dichotomies between security and justice. And I think Mayor Lopez has really shown us how that can actually be lived in a city at the micro level. And I think in so many countries in the world, there's this extraordinary yearning for things to be done differently. These things, as I know in my day-to-day work, are not a necessary trade-off. People want both security and rights, and people are entitled to both security and rights. And those two things, I think, go together. And so I'm really grateful to this panel for the work they do every day, at Open Society for the extraordinary breadth of support we breathe into civil society around the world. To Mayor Lopez for your frontline work in showing us how this can be lived in the city, and to June to give you strength for the work you're doing ahead, and to thank you for the bravery and for the innovation that you're showing on the streets. So with that, everyone,
Thank you so much.
And thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Be safe.
Thank you.